Sergeant, Camp Color Sergeant Gerald Abercrombie will lead us in the pledge and salutes to the flag.
Good sees one this morning. We're starting by saluting the flag on top, the United States flag. State flag, even though we won the smallest state, I think we got more. Chihuahua's got more fight in it than the first side, but I think our state stands up for what's right. I salute the flag of South Carolina, next to one that we're all here today to honor our ancestors that so dearly believe in the cause. I salute the flag. And the Christian flag, which all of us know what it stands for. Jesus Christ our Savior. Allegiance to the Christian flag, the Savior, whose kingdom is one Savior, crucified, risen, coming again, life and liberty for all who believe. Be seated, please. Thank you.
Y'all sit down.
Yes, I'll sit. Someone could sit in that chair. Here, Mason, you sit. You're sitting on somebody's. Hold on.
Our speaker this morning is Reverend Creighton Lovelace. He's no stranger to the McGowan camps. Those of you who have heard Creighton speak before understand what I'm saying. Those of you who have not, you're in for a treat this morning. We have a dynamic speaker this morning. Creighton, come on, buddy.
Well, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
I've been on the road this week traveling up in the Old Dominion State, and I might have preached myself hoarse, but I'm going to give it my best this morning. I want to start off out of the book of Nehemiah, chapter 4. In the book of Nehemiah, that is where the Jews have been taken into captivity, and they have now begun to trickle back into the promised land, back into Jerusalem. And this is what Nehemiah said unto them. And he spake before his brethren and the army of Samaria, and said, What do these feeble Jews? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of the rubbish which are burned? Beloved, that is what our ancestors were being told to themselves in 1865. When your boys in gray out of Lawrence County, our boys in gray out of Rutherford County, and in all the counties throughout the defeated Southern Confederacy, many wondered, would they revive the stones that had been fallen? The stones of the memorials that had been erected for the patriots of the Revolutionary War, for the cause of liberty, freedom, and independence. The Yankee jackboot and heel was upon our throat and upon our defeated people, and many wondered, would we revive the stones of freedom, liberty, and memory yet again? And so it is. We could not even, our boys that had fought tooth and nail against the Yankee invader, they could not even wear the blessed gray uniform, many of them, which it was the only uniform they had, the only article of clothing they had left. And yet the Yankees passed laws that would allow them to be arrested if they had been caught on Main Street in Lawrence during that time period. And so it was that during this time, we had to pick up the remnant, the remains of what was left to rebuild the Southland. And so it was finally that in the late 19th century, in the 1880s, the 1890s, and then on into the early 1900s, finally, at long last, our economy had come to the point where we could begin to save up nickels, pennies, dimes, quarters, a dollar here, a dollar there, to finally erect a memorial to our honored dead. The Yankees had already done it. They'd already been hard at work going across the old battlefield, digging up the remains of the Union soldiers, of the Union dead, and gently, quietly, reverentially putting them inside of the sod of Dixieland, where many of them had been slain in battle or died of southern fever or southern lead. They buried them, and many of them became national cemetery. But your dead and my dead and the South dead were merely gathered up and thrown into a ditch and covered over, and not until many years later would there be placed a plaque saying there would be so many thousand of Confederate dead in this trench. I've seen 5 of them at the battlefield at Shiloh, and yet you go to Pittsburgh Landing and you'll find all the Yankee dead arrayed in beautiful rows in a beautiful cemetery. But yet we were denied the right to honor our dead. But then the time came that we would revive the stones, and we would erect these stones to become monuments to our dead. After the Jews had crossed the Jordan River in the book of Joshua, and they finally entered into the promised land many years before the events of Nehemiah, Joshua would command 12 men of the 12 tribes to go into the river, gather stones, and erect a memorial to the event of the crossing of the Jordan River. And it is here we read the following: that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask their father in time to come, saying, what mean ye by these stones? Generations have passed since 1910. Indeed, we are well over 100 years past 1910, and yet many Southerners, many boys and many girls have played, have walked, have went by, drove by the monument here at the public square in Lawrence. And many wondered, what do these stones mean? In the early years, they could go to their daddies, they could go to their grandpas, and they could ask them the question, what does that mean? What does that flag mean? What do those stones represent? Who are the boys in gray? And the men themselves could tell them the story, the deprivation, the suffering, the pain, the sorrow, the agony, the pride that they had in doing their duty unto God, to defend their home, their liberty, their fireside from the Yankee invader. But time passed. Wars came and went. As we see other monuments, more stones erected in memory of the men that would go fight in Europe in World War I and World War II. The Vietnam veterans that would go, the Korean veterans that would fight against communism, which even now is taking over our school system. And yet these little ones, they need to ask the question as well, what do these stones mean? Since the boys in gray are all dead and gone, it is now our duty, it is our responsibility to see what the charge says, that the true history of the South is preserved for future generations. But yet every year our children are marched into public propaganda, public school system, and they are told between 900 and 1,100 hours every year that what these men did was treason. And yet if we happen to go to church every single Sunday morning, your children may get 52 hours if you go to morning worship. If you get Sunday school and morning worship, that's 104 hours a year. I wish it was a week. We need it. And people wonder, why is the church declining? Why are we the only ones here? This square should be filled. We should have filled a football stadium with descendants of these Confederate men that are honored here today.
Amen. Amen.
But yet we have the dwindling line of gray that today is holding the line. Why is that? It is because we are allowing ourselves to lose our Southern identity. As our patriotism has swelled all throughout since the war, the South is the region which sends the most military men and women to the United States Armed Forces. Our valor and our patriotism has not diminished. But what is diminishing is our Southernness. We are allowing ourselves to be phased out. When our children go into the propaganda system and then they are taught that these men are traitors, I merely urge you to look at Article 3, Section 3 in the present United States Constitution. It will say that treason against the United States shall consist in levying war against the state, against them, or in aiding or giving their enemies aid. Now, last time I checked, them and their are plural terms, meaning that this nation, the United States, was a compact theory, as Calhoun said. It was not one nation. That is why when I say the Pledge of Allegiance, I do not say one nation, because it is not one nation. Indeed, you can go back to the inaugural addresses of Presidents John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, James K. Polk, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. Every one of those presidents called this nation, the United States, a confederacy. What changed? What changed is we lost our war for freedom. We lost our war for constitutional Republican form of government. We lost our war to preserve our God-given rights. And instead, what we had bequeathed to us is not a nation of the people, by the people, and for the people, as Lincoln said at Gettysburg. In honest truth, what he said applied to the Confederate soldier, not to the Yankee invader that he was there memorializing that November in 1863. What we had given to us, ladies and gentlemen, is an empire. That empire went forward and first squandered and collected on the sovereign Confederate States of America. That empire then went forward in the Spanish-American War and got Guam, Hawaii, and illegally invaded the Kingdom of Hawaii. Then we got involved over in Europe. We became the policemen of the world, and we still are today. We have troops scattered all around the entire globe, and yet we need some men on the border to plug the border, or else there will be no country left. Why is it that we in the South see these things? Because we are a separate people. But if we lose that Southern identity, children will come and ask, where were those stones that used to be here? Proverbs 22:28 tells us the following: remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. Today, because of the indoctrination of the public socialist system called the public school system, our children are taught that they should not honor their Confederate dead. Our children are taught the war was over slavery. Our children are taught to look to themselves as American and not to their state. You, of all people, have the glorious distinction, and that blood runs in my veins as well, as half of my family came from the great sovereign state of South Carolina. You of all people have the distinctive glory that you were the first to call for independence. You led the fight, you led the way. Where are we now? We have to lead the way, otherwise this monument in 10 years will be pulled down and will be destroyed. Unless we step up to the plate and make sure the charge is being enacted. We cannot give up. The Sons of Confederate Veterans has had right now about 30,000 members, but from 1954 until now, there are some odd 72,000 men walking around that are no longer members. They stopped paying their dues. Why? Did some of them get disillusioned? Did some of them join for the wrong reasons? We have over 70,000 men walking around that should be in our ranks, but that pales in comparison when you look at the 10 to 20 million descendants in this country who had Confederate heritage and ancestors. That's why I say there should be standing room only. We have deserted our heritage, many of us here in the South, and the South now calls you back home. As Vice President Pence said during the 2016 campaign, he called out to all Republicans, Republicans, come home. That is what we have to cry out today. Southerner, come home. Come home to Dixieland and take your stand to live or die in Dixieland. Because, beloved, I have watched in my state, in the city of Durham, that has been taken over by leftist, liberal, socialists. We've seen outsiders from the state of Virginia, liberals from the city of Charlottesville, come down and rabble-rouse in Durham. And they went to the county courthouse, and they went and looped a lasso around the statue. And these teenagers and their ilk pulled the statue down. All the while law enforcement stood by and watched it happen. This past week, a young activist got red paint and her own red blood, mixed it together and went to Chapel Hill and threw this mixture onto the monument to the Chapel Hill dead at a statue, a monument called Silent Sam. All the while, a law enforcement officer stood by and did nothing. Those people that pulled down the monument, the public monument in Durham, they were brought up on charges, and the DA dismissed all charges. And today they walk free. If they can't even be branded a felon, if they can't be deprived of their voting right, if they won't be thrown in jail, what message does that send? It is all right to go out and desecrate Confederate monuments, for then there will be no repercussion. That is why you have to stand guard over these stones to ensure that people who are not informed of the truth do not remove the ancient landmark which our fathers have set forth as a memorial to our dead. If we don't do it, no one else is going to. Look around you today. You say, well, I don't want to be controversial. Too late. I don't want to rock the boat. The boat is already rocking. The question is, are you going to sit there and let the thing be capsized? Or are you going to sit and tell the man to sit down and listen to the truth? This is no longer a time when we can afford to be a mere history club or a genealogical society. This is a time when we have to realize that what we are witnessing is the death of the South. And if we don't educate our young people, our own family, if we don't get in the school system and let our voices be heard, if we don't let our presence be known, in 25 years will this event even take place. There must be hands to pass the torch to, because I look around, none of us are getting any younger. It is up to us to make sure that that rising generation is ready to take charge of these stones and to preserve that heritage and this history for a future generation. William Henry Trescott said the following: "This monument perpetuates the memories of those who, true to the instinct of their birth, faithful to the teaching of their fathers, constant in their love for the state, died in performance of their duty, who have glorified a fallen cause by the simple manhood of their lives, the patient endurance of suffering, and the heroism of death, and who, in the dark hours of imprisonment, in the hopelessness of the hospital, in the sharp agony of the field, found support and consolation in the belief that at home they would not be forgotten. Those for whom they died inscribe on this marble the solemn record of their sacrifice, the perpetual gratitude of the state they served, the undying affection of those whose lives the separation of death has shadowed with an everlasting sorrow, scattered over the battlefields of the South, buried in remote and alien graves, dying unsoothed by the touch of familiar and household hand. Their names here to recall to their children and kinsmen how worthily they lived, how nobly they died, and in what tender reverence their memory survives. Let the stranger who may in the future times read this inscription recognize that these were men whom power could not corrupt, whom death could not terrify, whom defeat could not dishonor, and let their virtues plead for just judgment of the cause in which they perished. Let the South Carolinian of another generation remember that the state taught them how to live and how to die, and that from her broken fortune she has preserved for her children the priceless treasure of their memories, teaching all who may claim the same birthright that truth, courage, and patriotism endure forever. And it is your heritage and mine. And I'll tell you right now that I, for one, will not be silent. I will not be quiet. I cannot be quiet because in my veins runs at least 89 Confederate soldiers' blood. In my heart beats their memory. And I will be danged if I'm going to let a socialist communist who eats Tide Pods and snorts condoms tell me they know better than me the record of my forebears and my forefathers. I will not be quiet, neither should you. So, my dearly beloved, continue to keep standing. Continue to let your voice be heard. Continue to tell people this is not about slavery. It is not about racism. It is not about white supremacy. It is about courage, God, family, country, patriotism. And those are the foundational stones on which we have stood since 1776. Those are the stones which were torn down by the Yankee invaders and burned and turned to rubble. Those were the stones our forebears picked up, and they set these foundations to let this monument be erected to our dead. These are the stones that cry out to us today and say, let us not be forgotten. Let this cause not be destroyed, but ensure that the landmark is not removed, that it will continue to stand for future generations. And so therefore, my dearly beloved, always keep that light and that torch burning inside of your heart, and never be ashamed that you are from the old state of South Carolina, the Palmetto State. Long may she and her glorious flags wave of the cause of which they fought and the cause which still remains alive today. Thank you, God bless you, and may God bless Dixie.